We're now in Daf Samaches Omid Beis, and we're about to study a Machlok Shin Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim in the Bryce that we started on Samaches Omid Aleph, in the case specifically of Shochares Imo V'Achakach Chatocho. Right? So he shechted the mother. At the time of the Shechita, there was an aver, there was a foreleg that protruded outside the mother's womb, and then after the shechita, he cuts off that limb. Now that limb, l'chora, is nevela because it died without shechita. Says Rabbi Meir, habasar maga nevela. In other words, there is a connection here, a maga, between that aver that was cut off, that had been in a state of protrusion outside the mother's womb at the time of the shechita, and therefore if you touch nevela, meaning the body of the animal, or at least it's easier if we talk about the body of the fetus, is in direct contact with that foreleg, with that aver, and therefore it's tameh. Just 1 second. B'chachamim omrim maga treifa shchuta. So again, this particular part of the sugya is very, very complicated, very sensitive. I'm just going to give you the general superficial approach, and that is that the foreleg, although it was extended outside the mother's womb at the time of the shechita, nevertheless, it's still part of the fetus, and it's still alive. Everything's alive. The fetus is alive, the foreleg is alive. And therefore the Chachamim, as opposed to Rabbi Meir, of the opinion that the shechita of the mother, since it works and operates for the fetus as well, it will be meaningful for the foreleg, even though the foreleg is treifa, because it was extended beyond the womb at the time of the shechita, but nevertheless the shechita is meaningful for a treifa. Now, how could that be possible that if a shechita is meaningful for treifa? And the answer is, this is what we've been learning all along, that nevela is metame a tuma chamura, but treifa, through the shechita, becomes tar. So again, even though you're not allowed to consume it, but as far as tumah is concerned, maybe it's a tumah d'Rabbanan, we don't know, but it's not really tameh. In any event, getting back to Rav, Katani mia Reisha, let's go back to the Reisha, Hotzi ubres yalav zero v'achach shochet. If the animal protruded, it's falling, and then bring it and brought it back into the mother's womb before the shechita, is then mutar b'achila, you're allowed to eat it. Now, to tell me that you're allowed to eat the fetus, I don't need that. Obviously, what you're telling me is you're allowed to eat the foreleg. My lav ha'ever. Lo. Ubar. So Gemara says, what are you talking about? Ubar. Ema seifa, shachet es imo ve'achach gzira, aser be'achil ve'bi ubar, amai aser. In the case where he shechted the mother, and then afterwards, the foreleg that was outside of the mother's womb at the time of the shechita was now brought back into the mother's womb, it's aser b'achila. Now, why should it be aser b'achila? I ubar amai aser. If you're telling me that the word aser goes to the ubar, because according to Rav, you can't say it's going on the foreleg because the foreleg is that's nothing to talk about. Now, why should the uber be aser? Just because the foreleg went outside of the mechitza of shechita, that doesn't aser the fetus. The fetus remained within the mechitza. And once again, the Gemara is going to invoke the principle of Rav Nachbar Yisrael Nitzcha El Lamokum Chatach. The chiddush of the brisa is that the mokum chatach is asur. Hachanami lo nitzcha el mokum chatach. Frek Gemara, again a kash on Rav. Aini, is this really so? That even though the foreleg was extended and then it was drawn back, it still remains treifa. V'haki asi. Now we get to the brisa of parsa hechzir echol. Parsos hechzir echol. Hechzir parsa echol parsa. My love. Okay, before we get to my love, let's just read the pasuk. The pasuk says in Dvarim Yudalit, Kol behema mafreses parsa v'shosa shesa shtei prosos. Malas gave Bemos Tochelu. What's the shtei prasa? Two hooves. And this pasuk is the source for the fact that the shechita of the mother works and it operates to permit the fetus, which we derive from the extra kol. It says kol behema, and then it says ba behema. Ba behema, it means within the animal. Okay, but that's not really so relevant for us. We want to understand the parsos, the hooves. And the pasuk opens up with parso in the singular, and then it says shtei parsos, two hooves. And according to the brisa, what is being said here and taught in this pasuk, that sometimes one hoof of the fetus is permitted, and sometimes all the hooves are permitted. There are times when the entire fetus, all the hooves, is mutter by virtue of the mother's shechita. There are times when only part of the hoof, which is called parsa, one hoof, is rendered permissible. Thus, a hoof that it drew back, you're allowed to eat. Hooves that it drew back, you're allowed to eat. If the fetus put forth both forelegs, drew back only one of them, you can eat that limb, but not the other. But if it put forth and drew back both forelegs, then you can eat both of them. So you see, everything depends upon whether or not the hoof was returned and drawn back into the body. If it was, then it's mutter. And that's against Rav, because Rav says that once it became a treifa, it always remains a treifa, even if you bring it back in. Gemara says, lo, hichzir parsa echol ubar. What's this business over here? Hichzir parsa. If the hoof was extended and then it goes back, then the uber is mutter. That's how Rav is learning. I uber, my area hichzir afilu lo hichzir nami. Why are you telling me that the hoof came back in and therefore the fetus is mutter? That doesn't make any sense. The fetus is mutter whether or not the hoof came back in or not. Rav Nachbar Yitzchak for the third time, lo nitzcha el l'makom chatach. The chiddush here is that when you cut off that limb, and the question is, the place where you sever the limb, is that considered part of the ubar, and therefore it's permitted through the mother's shechita? Or do you say no? It's not really that part where you severed the limb is not enclosed in the womb, and therefore considered as if it went out of the boundary of the womb, and therefore the shechita cannot be operated. The Tana quotes two psukim, Parsa and Parsos. If you're telling me only the halacha of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, then why do you need two psukim for that? The answer should be, my love, chad li aver v'chad l'mokum chatach. Meaning that the aver remains asur even though it went back into the mother. No. Sorry. I got mixed up for this. Sorry. Oh, the Brisa says, Parsa hichzir echol, Parsos hichzir echol, meaning it's mutter. So you see clearly that when it comes back into the mother's body, it's mutter against Ra. Look. Why do we need two psukim? Chad l'mokum chatach, as we saw in Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, v'chad l'kolut b'mei para. Okay, now we get into machlokas, the Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. And this is called kolut b'mei para. What's the case? Each leg has a single hoof rather than split hooves. So you and I would have said it's a non-kosher animal. But we're going to derive from this pasuk, because it says parsa hoof in the singular, that it's possible for an animal to be kosher even if its hooves are not split. Each leg has a single hoof rather than split hooves. A fetus whose hooves are not split, again, how you do this without taking an x-ray, I don't know, is found in the womb of a slaughtered cow. Maybe they found it after the slaughter. And the hooves are not split, but each leg has a single hoof. And Reb Shimon holds it's also. The Omer Reb Shimon, kol it ben para, also. You know, if you're going to join the two hooves together of the two legs, that's not split hooves. Hani mili echadi yotzeli avra olam. Again, this exeris hakos, it makes no sense logically, but if you discover these single hooves and you want to combine them to make two hooves while the animal, the fetus is in its mother's womb, then the shechita works for such thing, even according to Reb Shimon. Because Reb Shimon's chumrah of kolit ben para asur only applies after yotza liavra olam. Okay, now let's get back to Ula Rabbi Yochanan. Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if the foreleg goes out before shechita, but then it goes back in, then the shechita is meaningful, and you're allowed to eat the foreleg. V'ever atzmo mutar. Frek the Gemara, Amalei Rabbi Yehuda Ula, Ever atzmo osur. We already had a psak of Rav, and Shmuel also agreed with Rav, that the limb itself remains osur. Amalei, so now Ula is going to respond and say, you know, I have all great respect for Rav and Shmuel, but I disagree with them. I hold like Rav Yochanan. If I could only have some of the dust from the grave of Rav and Shmuel, I would fill up my eyes with it. I hold Rav and Shmuel in such esteem, I would consider myself fortunate if I could put the dust from their graves in my eyes and be enlightened by their wisdom. But Elahachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, I don't follow Rav and Shmuel. When Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, I follow Rabbi Yochanan. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Hakol hayu bichlal bosa basada v'treifa lo sochelu. Anything that leaves its mechitza is asur to bachila, and therefore they should remain asur even after they go back into the mechitza. But kisheparat lecha hakosuv gavi chatos sheyotza chutz mechitza v'chozra asur, since the Torah went out of its way to teach us that in the case of chatos, if it went outside of the azara, even though you brought the animal, the chatos, back into the azara, it remains asur. So it means in every other case other than chatos who depart rachmana ba, avol kol mili keva dehadur sharit. Any case of something that leaves its bounds and it goes back into its original bounds, like for example, the foreleg that left the bounds of the womb, but it was drawn back in, then the shechita, the mother, is operative and valid for that foreleg. And chatos is the only exception. Meisvei, the Gemara now objects to Rabbi Yochanan, or Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. There's a brice that says Ma Tamid Lomar. Why the extra word treifa? And the answer is Lafi Shematzina v'Masasheni Bikurim Shafal Pishiyotzu Chutzim Chitzasim v'Chazru Mutarim. Let's say you took Masasheni or Bikurim outside of Yerushalayim, and then you brought it back into Yerushalayim, Mutarim, Yachalaf, Zekain. Maybe I would think that Basar Basada Treifa, the same thing should apply, that even though it became Treifa by taking it out of the Mechitza, now you could bring it back in. Like the case of Ma'aser Sheni and Bechar, that even though it left Yerushalayim, you could take it back in. Talmud Loma Treifa. My Talmud Loma. What are you deriving for the word Treifa? Omar Rabba Kit Treifa. That if the basar went chutz l'mechitzaso, it's like a treifa. Ma treifa kevich nitra shuv ein la heter, af basar kevich yotza chutz l'mechitzaso shuv ein la heter. And that supports explicitly Rav, that once it became a treifa, you can't bring it back in to the mother's womb and be matter it. The shechita is not going to be meaningful because it once went chutz l'mechitzaso, it's treifa, and that's the end of the story. Ishuvein lo heter. Tiyufta de Ula. So now we upshlag Ula and Rabbi Yochanan. Tiyufta. Omar Mar lefisha matzina Maseches Sheni ubikurim. Where do we know that Maseches Sheni bikurim that were taken outside of Yerushalayim and then brought back into Yerushalayim are still mutter? Heicha matzinu dechsiv lo sucha lechal b'sharecha maser degoncha etc. B'sharecha hu delo techal. You can't eat Maseches Sheni or Bikurim in the cities of Israel. Is b'sharecha hu delo techal aval yatzu chutz v'chitzason v'chazru mutarim. So you're not allowed to eat it outside Yerushalayim. If you bring it back into Yerushalayim, then it's mutter. The pasuk implies that Maseches Sheni Bikurim, although you're not allowed to eat it outside Yerushalayim, they may be eaten if they are returned to within their bounds. And b'marava masnu hachi. So now the Gemara has a brand new formulation of the Machlokas, Rav, and Rabbi Yochanan. We thought that Rav and Rabbi Yochanan were arguing about the definition of treifa when it came out of its mechitzas and then it went back in. No, the Gemara says that in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Omar Yesh Leida Levarim, once the limb leaves its mother's womb, it's born already, it's Yilud. And Rabbi Yochanan Omar Ein Leida Levarim, there's no such thing as a Chal Shem, a halachic status of being born if it's only a limb, because the fetus itself has not been born. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan holds if the limb is drawn back, it can be eaten on the base of the mother's shechita because the limb is not considered born. Whereas Rav holds the limb is already considered born, and therefore the shechita of the mother can't work. What's the nafkamina between the original formulation of the machlokas, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and the new formulation? The nafkamina is going to be if a section, a portion of the limb was outside the womb and the other portion of the limb was inside the womb, so only part of the limb went outside the womb. If you go with the first understanding of the Machlokes, Rav and Shmuel, okay, that part of the limb that left the mechitzos is treifa. But that part of the limb that's still within the mother's womb never left its bounds, and it's not a treifa. But if we go with the second version of Rav, that the question is whether it's considered already a yilud, then if the majority of the limb has already left the womb, that's called a leda. And once that's called a leda, then it can no longer be subject to the shechita of the mother. And now the Gemara has a whole series of vacillations. Now there's a gigantic machlokas here. How do you read that line? We're going to go according to Rashi, even though everybody rejects Rashi, that it means that we're going according to Rabbi Yochanan, who holds ein leida leivarim. But what happens if hotzi ha'ubres yodav zero v'chazav hotzi is yodav zero? What happens if multiple times the fetus put forth its leg and drew it back? So, for example, there was one foreleg and another foreleg. Until finally, if you calculate it all, again, not at one point, but in time, then the majority of the foreleg went out. And we're holding now that ein leida leivarim. But now it's not just leivarim because it's already the majority of the fetus. Mao. Or should we say the moment that limb was brought back in is gendikt? That's end of story because ein leida leivarim. And now, although another limb, a second foreleg, emerges out of the body, you cannot combine it and integrate it together with the first forelimb because the first foreleg was closed book. It's already finito. Why is it finito? Because it was part of the fetus, and going to Rabbi Yochanan, ein leida leivar. Then the Gemara says, if you're going to tell me that once that foreleg goes back into the womb, then that closes the book as far as that foreleg is concerned, because ein leida leivarim, but hotzi uberes yoda v'chatocha, because of hotzi is yoda v'chatocha, shlima lerubo mal. What happens if every time the fetus protrudes one limb, they cut off the limb, they sever it? At this point, you have to admit that most of the ubar is outside of its mother's body. And even Rabbi Yochanan, who holds ein leida leivarim, would have to admit here that there is leida, odilma ruba vasachas be'inon. Or should we say that we need v'vasachas? I'd love to know what the Rogatchover would say about this Gemara. I think it's so typical of him, but I don't have the time to do it. Toshma, the Gemara wants to answer this question. Zaklal, let's go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says at the end of the Mishnah, Zaklal Dovish Gufo also. If you cut off from the body of the animal, like the spleen or another part of the animal, the kidneys, is then that's called Avrim and it's prohibited. But She'enim a Gufa Mutter. But if it's not part of the animal's body, but rather part of the fetus, then that which you find inside the mother's body and you shechted the mother is mutter. Shein gufa masuye mai. What did the Mishnah want to include by adding that clause? That she'ein begufa, it's mutter. Lav lasuye kai gavna. Maybe it's including the case like this one, where the fetus's limbs were successfully put forth and severed till the majority of the body was emerged, and the Mishnah is telling me that it's still permitted through the shechita of the mother because there's no leda on less than the majority of the fetus, even though now almost all the fetus is removed. Lo, says the Gemara, le asuye kolut b'mei para. V'aliba the Rabbi Shimon. The afal gav the Rabbi Shimon kolut ben para asur. That you can't join the two hooves that are inside the mother, the cow. And it's not a kosher animal because each hoof is not split. And that's only because the fetus was born, and this very strange fetus that has, two single hooves on the two forelegs, and it's only split hooves if you combine the two. But if somehow, I don't know again the logistics how you do this, you could discover the single hooves of the fetus while the fetus is still inside the mother, and then you went and you shechted, then even Reb Shimon would agree that it's mutter. Give me just 1 second before we end. I just want to think about this. In other words, I think what the Gemara is saying here, again, I say this with limited liability, that before the fetus is born, it's like part of the mother. And therefore, Reb Shimon could concede that we can create split hooves with this fetus by integrating this hoof with that hoof. But once the fetus is born, and it stands on 2 feet or 4 feet, so it's an entity unto itself. Take a look; it doesn't have split hooves. That's when Reb Shimon holds Yotzeli Avra Olam. Then it's treif, non-kosher. And this leads us to Boy Reb Chanina, which in Mitzvah Hashem we'll pick up tomorrow. I think at 9:30. Is that it? I got that right? Okay, have a great day.